The room was already full when I walked in, and I could tell from the way people were seated that this had been planned down to the last detail. The front rows were reserved, the aisle left clear, and a small table stood near the casket with a single envelope resting on it. No one explained why it was there, but everyone kept glancing at it as if it carried weight far heavier than paper. The air felt formal, controlled and final, like a decision had already been made before anyone was invited to witness it. When the service ended, there was no pause for conversation or reflection. My father stood first, straightened his jacket and thanked everyone for coming. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He said my grandfather had been a man of structure, order and foresight, and that it felt appropriate to honor him by handling things properly. That was the word he used, properly. Then he gestured toward the envelope and said the will would be read now, so the family could move forward without confusion. No one asked who decided that timing. No one questioned why it had to happen here, in front of everyone, while grief was still fresh and heavy. I noticed my brother nodding along, already comfortable, already certain. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. That was the first moment I understood this wasn't just a formality. It was a performance. And I hadn't been cast in the lead. Hi, I'm Daniel. This is my story. Before that day, I thought my relationship with my parents was complicated but stable. We weren't close in the emotional sense, but there was an understanding about roles and expectations. They handled finances, they handled appearances, they handled decisions. I stayed out of their way and built my own life quietly, assuming that when it came to family matters like inheritance, fairness would speak for itself. I was wrong about how much silence can cost. My grandfather had been the only person in the family who treated me like an equal adult. He asked questions, he listened. He didn't confuse obedience with respect. In his final years, I spent more time with him than anyone else did, not because I expected anything, but because he asked me to. I never thought that would matter. Apparently it mattered enough for other people to notice. Standing there at the funeral, I realized decisions had been made without me long before that envelope appeared. My parents had taken control of the process under the guise of responsibility. My brother had aligned himself with them without hesitation, and I was expected to accept whatever was read aloud as if it were inevitable, unchangeable, and deserved. My wife stood beside me, her hand resting lightly against my arm. She didn't say anything, but her silence was different from mine. It wasn't submission, it was awareness. She was watching the room the way someone does when they sense something isn't right, but don't yet know where it will break. As my father reached for the envelope, I felt the shift. Not panic, not anger, just the clear understanding that whatever happened next would change how this family existed, and that no matter how politely it was handled, there would be no way to pretend afterward that things were the same. The envelope was thicker than I expected, sealed carefully, my grandfather's handwriting visible where my father's thumb rested. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he took a moment to explain how difficult the past few months had been, how responsibility had fallen on him and my mother to keep things orderly, how emotions could complicate matters if they weren't managed correctly. Every word sounded reasonable. That was the problem. Reason was being used to justify control. As he spoke, I noticed my brother lean back slightly, crossing his arms with the ease of someone who already knew the ending. He wasn't grieving anymore. He was waiting. When my father finally broke the seal and unfolded the pages, my brother didn't look at the paper. He looked at me, just briefly, then away again. The will began the way most do, with formal language and careful phrasing. Assets listed, accounts referenced, properties named. My parents stood close together, reading along as if they were following a script they'd rehearsed in private. Nothing unexpected yet, but the structure itself told a story. Everything was framed as though the family already existed as a single unit, with decisions flowing through one channel. Then my father reached the section about distribution. He read my brother's name first. There was no pause before it, no hesitation. My brother was to receive the house, the one my grandfather had lived in for decades, not immediately, but upon completion of certain arrangements. My father didn't explain what those arrangements were. He didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. Control would stay with them. My brother didn't react outwardly. He simply nodded once, almost respectfully, as if acknowledging a compliment. My mother placed her hand on his shoulder, pride flickering across her face before she composed herself again. Around us, relatives shifted in their seats, murmurs spreading softly but stopping short of objection. This was being presented as normal, as expected. I waited for my name. It didn't come. The will moved on to personal items, to charitable donations, to procedural language about executors and timelines. Each sentence tightened the space around me. I told myself to stay calm, to let it finish. There were still pages left, still room for correction, but the longer it went on, the more obvious it became that omission was the point. My wife's hand tightened against my arm, just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to remind me I wasn't imagining this. When the final page was read, and my father folded the papers back into a neat stack, the silence that followed felt deliberate, heavy, like everyone was waiting to see how I would behave. My father cleared his throat and said the family would discuss details later in private. He said now wasn't the time for questions. He thanked everyone again and suggested we move to the reception area. Just like that, the reading was over. People began to stand, chairs scraping softly against the floor. Conversations resumed in low voices. My brother was immediately surrounded, congratulated in that careful way people use when money is involved, but grief is still present. My parents stayed where they were, watching me from a distance, measuring. I hadn't been named. I hadn't been acknowledged. And yet no one seemed surprised. That was when I understood the pressure wasn't coming. It was already here. The expectation wasn't that I would protest. It was that I would accept being erased quietly, in public, so nothing would have to be explained later. As we walked away from the casket, my wife leaned closer and spoke for the first time since the reading began. She didn't sound angry. She sounded certain. "That wasn't an accident," she said, and in that moment I knew staying silent would mean agreeing to something I hadn't consented to, and walking away would mean letting them decide who I was in this family forever. The reception hall filled quickly, the way it always does after a funeral, with people trying to replace discomfort with food and small talk. I stayed near the edge of the room, watching my parents move from group to group, thanking people for coming, accepting sympathy like it was something they had prepared for. My brother stayed close to them, never quite at their side, but never far enough to be mistaken for uninvolved. He looked relaxed in a way that didn't match the day. No one mentioned the will directly. That silence was intentional. It created the impression that nothing unusual had happened, that the reading had gone exactly as planned. When relatives spoke to me, they talked about my grandfather, about memories, about how hard this must be for everyone. A few of them avoided my eyes. A few looked at me too carefully, as if they already knew something they didn't want to say out loud. My wife didn't leave my side. She watched my family the way you watch a room when you know something is about to break. At one point she asked quietly whether I wanted to leave. I told her not yet. I needed to understand how far this had already gone. That's when my aunt approached us. She was my grandfather's younger sister, someone who had always kept a certain distance from the rest of the family. She didn't involve herself in arguments. She didn't take sides. She observed. When she stopped in front of me, she didn't offer condolences right away. She looked past me, toward my parents, then back again. "They didn't tell you, did they?" she said. It wasn't a question. I told her I wasn't sure what she meant. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. She said my grandfather had been worried in the months before he passed, not about dying, but about what would happen afterward. She said he'd asked her opinion more than once, asked whether silence was the same thing as approval. She didn't elaborate beyond that. She didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Before I could ask anything else, my mother appeared beside us. Her timing was precise. She smiled at my aunt, thanked her for coming, and gently steered the conversation away from whatever it might have become. When my aunt stepped back into the crowd, my mother turned her attention to me. Her voice was low, controlled. "This isn't the place," she said without specifying what "this" referred to. "We'll talk later." I asked when. She said soon. She always said soon. My father joined us then, his expression calm but alert. He placed a hand on my shoulder, not affectionately but possessively. He told me he knew this was difficult, that not everything could be explained in one day, and that patience was important right now. He reminded me that my grandfather valued unity above all else. That was the first time I felt anger rise sharply enough that it surprised me. Unity, in their language, meant compliance. It meant not asking why one son was named and the other wasn't. It meant accepting that decisions made behind closed doors were now final because they had been spoken aloud in public. My brother watched this exchange from across the room. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He smiled, just slightly, and lifted his glass in a gesture that could have been mistaken for support if you didn't know him better. My wife squeezed my hand again, harder this time. Whatever my parents planned to explain later, I knew it would come with conditions. And whatever my grandfather had been worried about, it was clear now that the real conflict hadn't ended with his death. It had just been moved into the open, where silence mattered more than truth. The meeting happened 2 days later, in my parents' living room, the same room where every major family decision had always been framed as a discussion, but delivered as a conclusion. The furniture was arranged carefully, chairs angled toward each other in a way that suggested openness while quietly limiting where anyone could sit. My parents were already there when we arrived. My brother showed up a few minutes later, late enough to signal confidence, early enough to avoid suspicion. My father started by saying he wanted to clear the air. He said the funeral had been emotional, and that emotions often distorted perspective. My mother nodded along, hands folded, her posture calm but watchful. They spoke about responsibility, about protecting the family name, about honoring my grandfather's legacy in a way that wouldn't invite unnecessary complications. Every sentence was measured. Every pause felt rehearsed. I asked them why my name hadn't been mentioned. The room went quiet in a way that felt intentional, like they had practiced for this exact question. My mother answered first. She said the will reflected practical realities. She said my brother had children, a mortgage, obligations that required stability. She said I'd always been independent, capable, resilient. She framed it as praise, but the meaning was unmistakable. I was being punished for not needing them enough. My father added that my grandfather had trusted them to make adjustments where necessary. He said there were informal understandings that didn't need to be spelled out in legal language. He said the public reading wasn't the full picture, just the appropriate one. That was when my brother finally spoke. He said he hadn't asked for any of this, but he also didn't deny benefiting from it. He said families weren't always equal, and that fairness wasn't the same thing as balance. He reminded me, calmly, that our parents had supported me when I was younger, that this wasn't abandonment, just redistribution. The way he said it made it clear he'd already accepted the outcome as permanent. My wife shifted beside me. She didn't interrupt, but when my father tried to speak again, she asked a simple question. She asked whether my grandfather had been informed of these adjustments. She asked whether he had signed off on them knowingly, or whether decisions had been made on his behalf once he was no longer in a position to push back. My mother's expression tightened just briefly. She said my wife didn't understand how these things worked. She said outsiders often confused process with intention. The word outsiders hung in the air longer than it should have. My father stepped in quickly, saying this wasn't about blame, it was about moving forward. He said challenging the will now would only create conflict, embarrassment, and long-term damage for everyone involved. Then he said something that changed the tone of the room. He said if I chose to make this difficult, there would be consequences, not threats exactly, just reminders. About family connections, about business ties, about how easily reputations could shift when disagreements became public. He said it calmly, almost kindly, like he was offering advice rather than leverage. That was when I understood the real purpose of the meeting. They weren't trying to explain the will, they were trying to close the door. My brother leaned back, arms crossed, watching to see whether I would accept the terms being laid out. My mother waited for me to nod. My father waited for silence. I didn't give them either. Instead, I asked one last question. I asked whether they would be willing to put their version of events in writing clearly, with dates and signatures, the same way the will had been handled. I said it casually, like it was a formality. The reaction was immediate. My mother told me that wasn't necessary. My father said that level of documentation would only complicate things. My brother said I was reading too much into it. No one agreed. And in that refusal, I saw exactly how fragile their control actually was. Because if everything they'd done was as clean as they claimed, they wouldn't be afraid to put it on paper. The silence that followed my question lingered longer than anyone expected. It wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. But something shifted in the room, subtle and irreversible. My parents had spent decades controlling outcomes through calm authority, through the assumption that no one would ever force them to explain themselves formally. And now, for the first time, that assumption was being tested. My father stood up and said the meeting was over. He said there was nothing more to discuss, and that continuing this conversation would only deepen divisions that didn't need to exist. My mother added that grief made people suspicious, and that time would help everyone see things more clearly. My brother didn't say anything at all. He avoided my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't uncomfortable with the outcome. He was uncomfortable with the possibility of it being questioned. We left shortly after. On the drive home, my wife didn't try to comfort me or tell me things would be okay. She just said that whatever my grandfather had intended, the truth would eventually surface, because people who rely on silence always underestimate how loud documentation can be. It was the first moment since the funeral where I felt steady again, not because the situation was resolved, but because I finally understood where I stood. 3 days later, my aunt called. She had been the quiet observer at the funeral, the one who hadn't spoken but hadn't looked surprised either. She told me she'd been uneasy about the will long before the reading. She said my grandfather had asked her months earlier to help him organize some personal records because he didn't fully trust anyone else with them. She hadn't interfered then, believing things would unfold as he intended. After the funeral, she realized they hadn't. She didn't accuse my parents directly. She didn't need to. She simply told me where the documents were stored and what conversations she had overheard while my grandfather was still alive. She said she wasn't sure how far I wanted to take things, but she didn't want to be complicit in something that felt wrong by staying quiet any longer. I didn't confront my parents again after that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't fight for the inheritance the way they expected me to. I just let everyone see who had already decided my place in the family and who benefited from it. So now I want to ask you this. If your parents controlled the will, silenced you in public, and your siblings stood there knowing the truth, would you have spoken up at the funeral or stayed quiet like I did? Tell me in the comments. Was I wrong for letting it end this way, or was this the only power I had left?